Ladies and gentlemen, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do, if you just finish up your drinks, but maybe leave your mugs here, and we're going to go down to the theatre and have a little entertainment for about half an hour, and then we come back and eat, drink, and be merry.
Okay, excellent.
All right.
I'm merry already.
You're merry. I think you should have that before. The idea tonight is just a short reading for you, as sort of with a Christmas flair to it, and a bit of a family flair to it. And I'm a bit nervous because rather a lot of family are here tonight, and it'll never happen again in Wolfville, probably.
Oh my! This is a presentation I made first a couple of weeks ago to the retired faculty of Acadia University. Every year they have a Christmas lunch, and for the last 10 years I've read them everything from Dickens to Saki to Watson Kirkconnell to John Milton and several others, Ogden Nash and so on. And once I gave them a piece of my own writing, which was about Christmas at Joe Howe's house in my novel, Joe Howe to the Rescue, my children's novel. Last week, I decided to test them again with another piece of writing, this time taking them back to the old country, and with a passage from the memoir that I've been working on for the last year or two. So this is what we have tonight, 30 minutes or so, and it's about one particular year of our family's life when we, well, I'll tell you, nearly 65 years ago it was, 1947, after a wartime of precarious farming in Devonshire and a year of wandering, my father and mother, together with a close friend, Wilmer Hesse, signed a lease with Captain John Henderson on his big country house 7 miles outside Oxford to open it as a country house hotel. Like my sister Josephine, I was still away at boarding school when they took possession on the 1st of March, but it was not long before my term ended and I took the train to Oxford, eventually arriving as darkness fell at the house which was to be our home for the next 14 years, Studley Priory, in the ancient village of Horton cum Studley. The piece I've chosen to share with you today describes our early life in that great Elizabethan house, ending up with our first Christmas there in December 1947. The Bawtree Chronicles, Chapter 3. Studley Priory may have become our home, but it was not to be long before the first guests wandered in for a meal or even took up residence. If we now had a home, we soon learnt that we were obliged to share it with other people. They came to a place which since the 1st of March 1947 had been gradually furnished from war surplus, from country auctions and junk shops. Many of the beds were of iron, such as we had at boarding school, the familiar thick curved piping at head and foot, with rails to hold on to in your dreams, and mattresses which had seen better nights. The bare boards of the corridors were lined with coconut matting, scratchy under bare feet. The tables in the dining room were big and small, mahogany and oak, round and square, fitted up with odd chairs culled from many cast-off dining sets. The armchairs and sofas in the lounge were of every floral design, rounded, creased and comfortable, worn from years of sitting and being sat on in other homes. The bedrooms were whitewashed, with the barest essentials of hanging rails and chests of drawers and bedside tables, and with the quintessential chamber pot under each bed. The lounge was changed from its Victorian green to a cheerful ivory. And among all these changes and all this cheap, utilitarian stuff, a few survivors from the world of the Hendersons, who had owned it since 1870, still kept their place too bulky to move. A full-size billiard table, with its vast carved legs and set of ancient cues, glass bookcases full of annual registers of the 19th and even late 18th century, along with Edwardian travel books, the kind which had no doubt adorned every country house in their day, with rod and gun in Canada, fox hunting in Rawalpindi, along Warwickshire's by-lanes. Oil paintings were fitted back into their niches in the panelled dining room walls for which they had been painted. The glorious 12th stood above the mantel, a huge antlered stag nervously facing the artist among the banks and braes. Opposite, a little girl and her mother sat in an arbour beside a gently rolling Victorian sea. The house's wartime occupation as a convalescent home for wounded officers had also left its mark. Only 2 of the rooms on the first floor boasted their own bathrooms, so 2 front bedrooms further down the hall had been converted into communal bathroom facilities, with 5 baths, each tub in its own latchable stall, the 8-foot separating walls made of pasteboard and brown linoleum on the floor. None of this was quite in the spirit of a great country house, but it was a time when lining up in dressing gowns outside shared facilities was the lot even of middle-class man and woman, even in the more expensive hotels. Our kitchen, with its ancient coal-fired range, soon to be replaced by a newer version, had been fashioned by the first Hendersons out of what had been the family chapel, and retained its high windows and lofty ceiling. The chapel wing was still complete with belfry. The bell, we were told, used to be rung by the lords of the manor at midday to signal dinner break for the labourers in the garden and the fields around. The Hendersons had also bequeathed us their gardeners. Sidney and George and their boss Taylor, known only by his surname in recognition of his senior standing, had worked the Priory gardens as young men before the First World War, in which they had all fought. And ever since, now in their 50s, they were true men of Oxfordshire, with the soft burr of the country, the slow, steady pace of the rustic labourer, the flat caps and aprons, and the deferential manners of the olden time. Old enough to have watched from a distance the proud folk of the Priory and their friends playing croquet on the lawn or tennis in the back garden during the golden years. They were the first and last people who ever addressed me as Master Michael, and my sisters as Miss Josephine and Miss Jennifer. My father was inevitably Sir, with a touch of the forelock. With these 3 stalwarts came all the venerable paraphernalia of the old garden, a green-painted and hump-backed lawn-mower from the 30s, still lovingly nursed and shining with oil, trailing clouds of blue smoke and clattering as it crisscrossed the sward. 2 or 3 vast and sculpted wooden wheelbarrows in faded blue and red, made perhaps by an estate carpenter before the turn of the century. Stately brass watering cans, spades and forks and edgers and axes and sickles and billhooks and secateurs, their old Sheffield steel hard as diamonds, ash handles worn smooth from years of work. Bamboo poles, binder twine, strawberry nets, scores of flower pots, huge trugs for bringing in the vegetables and flowers, and vast tree saws with their 5 or 6 feet of rippling toothed blade, an upright wooden handle at either end. The garden they had to work on demanded every tool in their shed. In front of the house, circled by the main driveway, spread one large lawn from which you looked west past a majestic single oak down over the fields and out towards Otmore. On its south side stood an enormous clipped yew tree. Behind the house, which was long and thin, stretched another lawn with fields beyond and Brill Hill in the far distance. At its north end, behind a slight rise, was the old tennis court, still to be reclaimed. South of it, hidden behind a tall, thick curtain of more clipped yew trees, was the more formal lavender garden, crazy paving pathways separating irregular beds edged with box and filled with lavender and shrub roses fragrant in their season, a tiled summer house in the corner. And beyond this again was the brick and stone wall surrounding the spacious vegetable garden, a 2 or 3 acre expanse of fruit trees and strawberry plants and gooseberry and raspberry and blackcurrant bushes and a peony walk and rows of vegetable beds. A gate on the far southern wall gave on to the paddock and the stables. The priory had its own central heating system, fired by 2 mammoth coal-burning boilers, one at each end of the long house. It was the job of Taylor, the head gardener, to arrive in the dark of early morning during the cold months, clean out the built-up clinker, refill the fireboxes, and set them blazing, then damping them down for their day's work. He would be back after nightfall to repeat the process. No doubt he had followed the same routine for 20 or 30 years. In the cold of winter, these 2 massive boilers consumed a ton of coal a week. My parents, in other words, had not simply leased a vast Elizabethan mansion. They had taken on the almost feudal trappings of a manor house, with its rigid routines, its old retainers, its high obligations, and, of course, its expenses. And all this was to be our home. The family had spent a year as little more than gypsies, camping in the bracken, lurching from suburban house to suburban house, depending on the kindness of relations. Sister Jo and I had shared this nomadic world in our holidays, leaving it every few weeks to return to the far greater stability of our boarding schools. Our young sister Jenny, now in her 5th year, had been carried along with our parents through those dire winter months. And then that March, suddenly, in one stroke, we had all stepped out of limbo and into this superabundance of stuff, of history, of beauty, all at once made kings of apparently infinite space. It was a world we children could never exhaust, never find the end of. I remember little of that first Easter holiday at Studley. I certainly had no conception at the time of the gargantuan task which Wilma and my parents had taken on. Father told me many years later that their entire capital at the outset amounted to no more than £500, which was, by the way, the annual lease of the house and gardens, £500 a year. Which explains why they did so much of the cleaning and renovating themselves. I have a distinct memory of Mother and Wilma in overalls with scarves round their heads, up ladders here, there and everywhere, dusting, brushing away the cobwebs, whitewashing. If they had an overall plan, surely they had a plan, I have no idea what it was. Where would you start on a job like that? Father, I think, kept out of the painting department, though he did undertake some crude and highly dodgy electrical wiring. He was no doubt busy preparing in other ways. There was advertising to devise, a brochure to put together, a cook to hire, a club license to apply for, legal business in Oxford, and I think meetings set up with the hoteliers of the county, picking up tips of the trade. In addition to her refurbishing work, Wilma sat with Father typing letters and preparing an already burdensome payroll. She also began to take over responsibility for the gardens, working with our old retainers to decide on plantings and jobs for the day. Within a year or 2, she bought our first Jersey cow and added milking to her other routines. The herd later grew to 6. Meanwhile, Jo and I reared on children's books in which middle-class boys and girls went off exploring a strange house and found themselves in the grip of an adventure, wasted little time before setting out to chart this new country called Studley Priory. We ventured up to the top floor with its quaint rooms under the eaves and its balcony looking over the back garden. These were soon to be the family's own quarters. We climbed out onto the leads of the massive old tiled roof. We crawled into the rocky space under the dining room floor, accessed through the tunnel, which in old days enabled the staff to cross from the kitchen to the rest of the house without disturbing the master at his dinner. We found our way along the worn stone-paved corridors to the furthest reaches of the house's south end, thought to have been once a part of the original priory. On fine days we ranged through the garden, its long grass now bright with daffodils, and climbed inside the cavernous yew trees. And on our first walk to pick primroses and violets in the 300 acres of woods which began at the bottom of the paddock, we came across a mysterious, railed and overgrown enclosure in its own small glade. Peering through the bars, we were excited and a little nervous to see a granite tombstone. One of the earlier Hendersons of Studley, we later found out, had insisted on being buried among his trees. We heard from Taylor about the day of his burial, with farmhands struggling and slipping through the mud in a slashing rainstorm to consign him here. Many years later, the back prospect of Studley was used as the home of Sir Thomas More in the film of A Man for All Seasons. We saw Thomas arriving up the Thames from London in a wherry and clambering over a wall into his garden. Later, Henry VIII arrived in his barge, and the two friends had their fateful conversation on and around a bench, past which I could see the window of my own bedroom. In fact, of course, the Thames was many miles away. The producers of the film had had a wall built both here and also on a reach of the river, cutting from one scene to the other as the Tudor gentlefolk climbed over. In that disastrous spring of 1947, after a disastrous snowy and frost-bound winter, we were lucky indeed to be high and dry above Otmoor and away from all rivers. Otmoor itself was underwater, visible from our front garden. The Thames and all its tributaries suffered their worst flooding since the 19th century, with water covering Port Meadow and Christchurch Meadow in Oxford to the depth of several feet. The whole of Britain was affected. The fens turned into an inland sea. River valleys became lakes. There were places where families had to retreat to their upper floors, with enterprising boys earning pennies converting zinc tubs into boats and delivering bread and groceries to the marooned. Canada, good old Canada, sent food parcels. Easter came and finally went. When Joe and I took reluctant leave of our magical new home and boarded our trains back to London and down to Kent, we could still see vast lakes along the rivers, trees and hedges and woods waterlogged, telegraph poles sagging and lines askew. But the floods had at last begun to recede. They left the country battered and heavily damaged, crops destroyed, countless roads and bridges washed away, and the Labour government, having soldiered through the freeze-up of the previous winter, reeling once again from this second natural disaster. This did not mean much to us. We were each quickly swallowed up into our respective schools in the Kentish countryside, comfortably protected once again from politics and the world outside for another 12 weeks, while spring slowly ripened into summer. By the time we boarding Bawtree children returned to Studley Priory in late July 1947, the business was slowly moving forward. We had engaged our first cook. Words like chef were not used in those days. A tall and charming young woman called Meg, who turned out to be superb in the kitchen and became a lifelong friend of the family. We had also picked up some staff from the village and the country round. There was Martha, who bicycled 5 days a week from Islip to wash dishes and scrub and clean. There was the miniature Mrs. Wardy, from the village, another scrubber and cleaner as well as bedmaker. There was 17-year-old red-haired Bill, who cleaned boots and shoes, peeled potatoes, brought in firewood and polished floors. And there was Mary Anstis, who did the guest rooms. The hotel had also taken in its first PGs, paying guests. They added up to what must have been a representative cluster of ageing, middle-class waifs and strays, often survivors from one or both world wars or from British India, and with enough money squirreled away even after those devastating years to be able to afford the unbelievable cheap rates of Studley Priory Country House Hotel. They paid 6 guineas, £6, 6 shillings a week, all found in those first seasons, a hearty breakfast, a 3-course lunch, afternoon tea with homemade scones and cake, and a 4-course dinner. Perhaps because they were our first in a long line of characters, wonderful and weird, they acquired something of a mythic status for us, initiating a fund of Studley stories recounted for years afterwards, especially by my mother, whose ear and memory for conversation and comments were as sharp as ever. There was the retired Judge Hildersley and his wife, who insisted on having their own private sitting room downstairs, as well as the best bedroom in the house, with ensuite bathroom. The judge was a mean-spirited, crusty old curmudgeon who played a lot of billiards, even with me when desperate, and with no other opponents available. He was short and bald, with a fringe of grey hair round his pate like a tonsured monk, and with a red parchment face behind his half-moon glasses that put one in mind of the notorious hanging Judge Jeffreys. We were sure he'd put on his black cap with pleasure many times, sending off some benighted offender to be hanged by the neck until he was dead. I never remember him smiling. There was the toothless, feckless Major Grey and his domineering wife. Major Grey was suspicious of any plate put in front of him and would pick up a knife and push the food around as though expecting maggots. To his querulous "What's this?" Mrs. G once replied in a voice booming across the dining room, "Oh, something hashed up from yesterday's leftovers." There was Mrs. Hyatt, a widow who was intent on keeping up social appearances, always immaculately coiffed and lipsticked, with black twinset and pearls, and in the highest of heels. She would flit around our rustic establishment as though she was teetering through the Savoy. An inveterate gossip, she would keep us up to date with the latest goings-on among her fellow guests, and like my mother had an ear for the quaint turn of phrase. She was delighted to tell us one morning that she'd been writing letters in her bedroom when our Mary, doing her daily chores, had knocked at her door and asked, "Anything in your chamber today, Mrs. Hyatt?" Not quite how they did things at the Savoy. There was Major General Davidson, a widower originally from New Zealand who had led a brigade in Mesopotamia in World War I, but had the sweetest and most pacific disposition of all those early Studley residents. Born around 1865, he was indeed a remnant from the Victorian age. He spent a lot of time in his room hooking rugs, one bearing his regimental badge. He came into the dining room one morning and, spying a fruit bowl full of oranges on the centre table, rubbed his hands, exclaiming, "Jaffas bejabbas." He was also rubbing his hands when he came back one day from a walk and said with glee, "Lots of hips and haws in the wood," to the blushing enjoyment of Mrs. Hyatt. He once had an old army chum to visit, and as my mother was crossing through the lounge at coffee time, after lunch, she heard the General reminiscing. "So I said to the staff officer, if we don't throw the pontoons across the Dum-Dum River, how the hell are we going to get the horses across?" When the above-stairs folk ceased to entertain my parents and became merely irritating, as they often did, there was always a smile or two to be had among the characters below stairs, and the ancient village of Horton-cum-Studley round about us, from which most of our casual labour came. The village still reflected the manorial culture which had spawned it in the Middle Ages. It was made up of any number of tied cottages, many of them thatched, all belonging to the Hendersons. Up the road from the entrance to the priory there was a blacksmith's forge, presided over by a wall-eyed old craftsman who lived in a pretty cottage opposite, and who made a sparser and sparser living on the repairing of agricultural implements and the shoeing of fewer and fewer horses, and the mending of an occasional bicycle. The sound of hammering from his smithy resounded across the fields into our garden for the first few years, until he shut up shop, or died, or both. It was an attractive place for a boy to visit, and I can still recall the smell of red-hot metal and the furnace with its hand-operated bellows, and watching through the steam as he shaped his horseshoes around the ancient anvil. Our gardener, Sidney Jones, lived across the road from the Priory copse with his permanently sickly wife Tilly, a sad sack to whom he was devoted. Closer to us on the same side lived the Warings with their children, including Bill, and next door to them the Ansters family with anything in your chamber, Mary. There was not much education to be had in the small village school down the hill near the church, but what there was of it seemed to have escaped the grasp of Bill and Mary, who combined sweetness of temper with a light hold on the things of the mind. Bill, our 17-year-old boot boy with his flaming red hair, had a sort of quiet insouciance which took our breath away. Scolded for peeling the potatoes so thickly that there was hardly any potato left after he was done, he plunged his hand into the dirty water of the bucket and pulled out one of his peelings. "Here's a thick bit," he said, with a charming smile. And once when he was polishing the floor, Mother came through and said reprovingly, "Oh, I'm glad to see you doing this, Bill. You haven't done it for 2 days." He replied with the same smile, "I haven't done it for a week." Bill was an army cadet, and once a year would go off to a 2-week training camp. One year, Father started one of his slightly patronizing but well-intentioned conversations with the hired help. "Oh, good to have you back, Bill. Where was your camp this year?" "Isle of Wight." "Oh, the Isle of Wight. I used to go on holidays there with my family when I was a boy. Where were you based? Weymouth, Newport, Sandown?" A slight pause. "They never told us where it was." Mary was a year or two older than Bill, and getting to be of marriageable age. Mother used to inquire kindly whether she had a boyfriend yet. "No," she replied rather gormlessly. Then at a village dance the story got about that she had danced with a boy. Mother asked whether she liked him. "Yes," said Mary. "Oh, good," said Mother encouragingly. "Have you heard from him since?" "No." "Do you know where he lives?" "Yes." "Well, why don't you write to him then and tell him you would like to see him again?" "Yes, I will." A week or two went by and Mother asked again, "Have you written to that boyfriend of yours yet, Mary?" "No." "Oh dear, why not?" "Mother's taken away me pen." It was the same mother who had had all Mary's teeth taken out when she was 16, so she wouldn't be bothered with them after that.
Oh.
Poor Mary.
Yeah.
Martha, cycling in from her village on Otmore, used to complain that her varicose veins were troubling her, and she showed my squeamish mother her swollen purplish calves. "Oh, poor Mother, that looks terrible." "Oh, it's nothing really," replied the stoic Martha. "You should have seen my mother's. They used to hang down her legs like bunches of grapes." Wardy from the council houses down in the village was a diminutive fireball who unsurprisingly was not a native of the village but had washed up here during the war as an evacuee from the East End of London. Mother loved her for her Cockney wit. One Christmas her whole family came from London for the festivities, and Mother asked how she could put them all up in her very cramped little house. She described where everyone slept and doubled up, and finished up with, "Oh, and Uncle Henry, he lost both his legs in the war, so he fits on the sofa just lovely." Our own family's best time was after the hotel's breakfast, when Mother and Wilma could join us at our table in the dining room, and at afternoon tea, which for the guests was served in the lounge, or even in summer out on the lawn or in the lavender garden. These tea time sessions were the quintessential family moment, when sandwiches and scones and cakes disappeared at speed and endless cups of tea drunk, and talk and quarrels and laughter went on until with sighs and groans Mother and cook Meg would get up to start preparing for the 5-course evening meal, for which the gong would be rung at 7:45. At the same time, once we had launched into having our own herd, Wilma would stride briskly off to milk the cows. Thus, with our parents' help, we managed even that first summer to start carving out our own private space within the stately home around us. And for me, having my own room marked almost the beginning of my privately imagined life. Sooner than I wished, September had swung around and it was time to return to school. The last night at home was always something of an occasion. We could choose our favourite dishes for supper, visited of course on the guests as well. And after the meal and the guests' coffee time, the family, including father, to my greatest delight, would head up to our private sitting room upstairs, where it became a last night tradition to play some riotous game. Slowly, while Joe and I were off at school once more, Studley Priory made its way. When Oxford's Michaelmas term began in October, my parents began to see Oxford dons and their families coming for lunch, or perhaps just for a drink and a snack in the bar. Even the wealthier undergraduates used to come, bringing their girlfriends to candle-lit dinners in the oak-panelled dining room and walking awkwardly hand in hand out in the garden. The hotel started developing a reputation for good food, and within a year or two was listed in the new Good Food Guide. Even Oxford celebrities made their way out through the Oxfordshire lanes to enjoy the very unluxurious but honest warmth and good spirits of the place. Sir Gilbert Murray, the great classical scholar and translator of Greek plays, and first president of the League of Nations, would be driven over from his home on Boar's Hill, and once even came to stay with us for a week. C.S. Lewis took to making the trip out to Studley a regular Sunday morning occasion for beer and conversation after church, with his brother Warren and his intimate Roman Catholic friend Dr. Havard. It was with that good doctor that my father, while drawing him his beer, was making polite conversation and asked, "Let me see, Dr. Havard, was your father a Catholic priest?" Later, C.S. brought his wife Joy, and once they even stayed for a week or two, playing Scrabble in the lounge using any language either of them knew. Dean Lowe of Christchurch, soon to become Oxford Vice-Chancellor, was also a regular, as were classicist and Oxford personality Maurice Bawtree, novelist Iris Murdoch, and archaeologist Jaquetta Hawkes. These worthies all added to the tone of the hotel, and money slowly started coming in a promising way. By the time December came round and we were back from another term at school, the bookings for Christmas were filled to capacity, and a New Year's Eve ball promised to sell out as well. While preparing for this festive onslaught, father and mother were not able to shrug off entirely their sense of noblesse oblige as lords and ladies of the manor, and decided that they should offer their loyal staff a Christmas party. It was held in the games room at the far end of the house on a Sunday evening after the guests had been dispatched with a light supper. The ping-pong table was taken down and the room transformed into the Priory Arms, complete with bar and hung with homemade Christmas decorations, including chains made of coloured paper, and holly from the garden, and mistletoe hung suggestively on one of the lights. My father was the publican, and Wilma and mother the barmaids. We children helped serving food and drinks, changing the 78 records and winding up the gramophone. Everyone arrived with their wives and husbands in their Sunday suits, and all were on their best behaviour. But the beer and the food slowly loosened them up, and soon George sang his song, "My love is an apple," and there was dancing. My father, who was a fine ballroom performer of the old school, chivalrously asked every female in the room to a dance, and squired them through foxtrots and quick steps and waltzes with impeccable grace. He met his match, though, when he finally approached one of our stalwart cleaners and asked her for the pleasure. "Oh, no, thanks, Mr. Bawtree," she replied amiably. "You see, when I dances, I sweats, and when I sweats, I stink like hell." Father also took his duties seriously when 15 or 20 village carol singers made their way up the long Priory driveway a night or two before Christmas, as they had no doubt done for centuries, to give us their somewhat drony Hark the Herald and While Shepherds Watched. After they had sung, he invited them all into the front hall, offered them drinks, and to the fury of Wilma and Mother, casually tossed a £10 note into their collection. Father always had something of a penchant for extravagance. Of all vices, he thought of meanness as the very worst, and behaved accordingly. He free-handedly tipped barbers and waiters and garage attendants. So now at Studley his vicarious position as Lord of the Manor played into his long-time habit, and it came triumphantly into its own. Of course the business suffered as a result. No corners were to be cut, no trifling economies could even be considered. When he decided to buy Joe a pony, and the sweet and portly little animal was led up to the Priory door by a local farmhand, Dad asked him what he wanted for it. £5, said the villager. Oh, that's not nearly enough, responded my father. I'll give you 10. This was a charming and generous trait, but no way to run a railroad, let alone a hotel. Father certainly knew how to give his guests a good time, especially in the early years when energy and optimism were high and there was room even to be playful. At that first Studley Christmas, as it approached, he casually mentioned to the slowly assembling guests how there was an old superstition that at midnight on Christmas Eve, the ghost of one of the nuns of the old Priory used to walk abroad in the garden. There was some story of her having died in the grounds in mysterious circumstances. After a superb Christmas Eve dinner, followed by games and carols, and crisp presents for each guest under the 10-foot-high tree in the drawing room, Dad looked at his watch and announced that midnight was approaching. It's probably all nonsense, but why don't we just have a look and see if there's anything out there? A frisson of nervous excitement ran through the more credulous guests as he drew the curtains, pulled back the tall shutters, opened the window, and looked out. He drew in his breath and stepped back. Goodness gracious, she's there! Come and look, quick! The guests crowded to the window. There, walking slowly across the lawn, heavily veiled and in a long white habit, was the nun. A ghostly glow lit up her chalk-white face, and a strange blue light shone around her. Slowly and sadly she walked past and on into the darkness. The guests were immediately buzzing with chatter. Many of them were doubtful, but some were genuinely moved and even weeping a little for the poor creature they had just seen. We children, of course, were in on the trick. Mother and Wilma had dressed up our tall cook Meg in a veil and habit. And Meg it was who walked forlornly over the lawn, holding a bicycle flashlight in the folds of her sleeves so that it shone up on her face, which was deathly white from a lavish application of flour. Wilma crouched below the open window, following Meg's figure with another torch, a piece of thin blue paper taped across it to give the final supernatural touch. Dad confessed the next day. The gullible ones were no doubt genuinely disappointed, and perhaps even annoyed at being made fools of. Mrs. Hyatt was tempted not to believe him. The judge was not amused. But for all of them, it was part of a Christmas to remember. For us children, the high point of that Christmas day came not with emptying our stockings or unwrapping our presents, exciting as these moments were, but after tea, when darkness had fallen. The double doors into the drawing room were closed behind my father and mother and Wilma for half an hour or so, while we, guests and family, waited outside in the lounge. Finally, the doors opened again and we were invited into the long, darkened room. No one brought up on electric Christmas tree lighting will ever quite be able to appreciate the magic of a huge tree lit entirely by candles. The minutely shifting points of flame, the little worlds of decorations lit by each, the smell of burning wax, and the miraculous glow of all the candles together, basking the whole high room in a glimmering light, took the breath away. There was more magic, too, in the briefness of the moment. As Dad stood by with fire bucket and extinguisher ready, we watched for perhaps 3 or 4 minutes as the candles in their holders burnt down too swiftly to their sockets. Then, with a sigh, the stepladder was brought out and the candles doused one by one. The lights were switched back on again, and the spell was broken. Another few days, and it was New Year's Eve. 30 or 40 couples came to celebrate at the Studley Ball. A band had been engaged and played many of the same dance tunes we had cranked out of the gramophone during the staff party the previous week. Smoke Gets in Your Eyes, The Way You Look Tonight, Someday I'll Find You, along with a new hit from South Pacific, Some Enchanted Evening. My diminutive Titian-haired mother was gorgeous in green velvet, and father had the air of a Ruritanian count in his white tie and tails. We danced a Scottish eightsome or two, I struggling along with the help of Sister Jo, and at midnight we joined hands for Auld Lang Syne. It was a boisterous end to a happy holiday season. 1947 was over. It had been a tumultuous year, setting us down after so long in the wilderness in a new and splendid home. The 3 proprietors of Studley Priory Country House Hotel, they called themselves the Props, had shown that they had all the charm, the energy and the imagination they needed to create a happy atmosphere for their customers and guests. They had somehow managed to make the place a home for everyone who fell under their spell, to the point that lapses were overlooked and imperfections forgiven. It was a place where the Duke of Grafton was able to wander down to the scullery to ask where he could clean his boots, where Oxford professors would bring their tea things out to the pantry, where service was sometimes erratic but always cheerful. Somehow, in spite of the load of work, father was also able to pursue his love of birds and of natural history in general. He spent many hours carefully mapping out the exact boundaries of robin territories in the Studley Gardens. One time he acquired a baby barn owl from a deserted nest, bringing him up in a large cage in the outbuildings. He often walked through the gardens and sometimes even through the house, with Henry perched on his shoulder. Once he brought up 2 fox cubs, later released, and for a year or 2 he bred up and more or less tamed a pet badger who would walk beside him through the lounge on a leash. He went on countless birdie walks, often taking a reluctant son or elder daughter with him, but usually accompanied eagerly by his youngest, Jenny, whose knowledge of birds was so great that at the age of 5 she was able to recognize every picture from father's copy of British birds. "That's a Dartford warbler," she would say airily, to the astonishment of the guests. And some of the guests too became wrapped up in his passion, going with him through the woods and learning the song of the blackbird, the call of the yellowhammer. Only the other day I heard from the daughter of an old schoolmaster that she owed her lifelong interest in birds to a walk at Studley with my father when she was 10. For my mother too, those early days at Studley gave her opportunities to display her extraordinary creative gifts. She shared many of the duties of cooking for the hotel, but she had time too for other things. Her treadle Singer sewing machine, bought back in Australia soon after she was married, and paid for in instalments, she told us. She would sometimes hide when she saw the man coming for his weekly 1 and 6pence and she had no money to pay him, was set to work making clothes for my sisters and herself, and chair covers and curtains for the hotel rooms, and turning sheets and pillowcases. She learnt how to make lampshades for all those bedside tables. She iced magnificent wedding cakes. She knitted fast and furiously when the guests were gone to bed. And every day in season, from the vast trugful of flowers which Sydney brought in from the garden, she would make the most striking and beautiful flower arrangements to decorate hall and dining room and lounge. Every guest found a vase or a jam jar full of flowers in their room on arrival. And Wilma, her demonic and generous energy was utterly taken up with the endless demands of this seigneurial but also business establishment, bringing up EMT, early morning tea, to every guest who ordered it, working in the garden, milking the cows, typing business letters, managing payroll, often waiting at table, and always sharing, as we children sometimes did too, in the endless chore of washing up the huge piles of dishes left after serving meals, sometimes to 20 or 30 customers. I think it's fair to say that in that first year of their great life venture, the props were happy, optimistic and fulfilled, and always buoyed up by their sense of humour, taking enormous delight in the strange things said and done by staff and guests alike. Out of these sayings and doings there emerged over the years their inexhaustible fund of anecdotes, a kind of family mythology, sustaining them for the rest of their lives and passed on to their children. For those children, the arrival of Studley in our lives was a somewhat different story. We were learning that we had to amuse ourselves for many long hours without the help and support of our parents. Our home was no longer just a family matter. But there were many compensations. Life in the hotel was rich and varied. We learnt to deal well with people, often having to greet guests at the door when no one else was about, to help with their luggage, to make conversation, or to answer their sometimes impatient questions. There were frequent visits to Oxford. There was swimming and punting on the Charwell. There were bicycle rides around the ancient villages of Hotmoor. There were occasional picnics, and there were our own rooms to come back to always. In these private spaces we could be alone. We could write our secret thoughts. We could cry at imagined hurts, at flashes of loneliness and fear. We could look at ourselves in the mirror, asking ourselves what this mysterious being in front of us was and would be. And we would begin to fashion, slowly and often painfully, our own ever more complicated lives. Thank you.